otherwise, because everything already is and goes in every which way. So absolute necessity is the holding together of opposites rather than the exclusion of something, of alternative possibilities. It's the inclusion of all alternative possibilities, and nothing can be otherwise because everything is already there, is the idea. There's a field with everything, and that's absolute necessity, as opposed to like a hypothetical necessity where things would go one way and are not able to go the other way. That other way is excluded. So it's a different conception of necessity. Absolute necessity is the total exhaustion of all possibilities. But this exhaustion happens only because it maintains every possibility within it, without excluding anything from it. Every possibility, even the possibility of pure alterity, what Hegel calls absolute possibility in the logic, so this appears in the logic, absolute possibility, must appear as one of the moments of necessity. Yet the inclusion of pure alterity radically changes the terms of what we might otherwise conclude about Hegel, that he is explicitly anti-apophatic. If Hegel requires a genuine moment of absolute possibility as a condition for the completion of necessity in the system, he thereby includes a radically exterior agent that throws totality into an open flux of contingency. This, indeed, is Hegel's conclusion from modality. Absolute necessity, he claims, is absolute contingency. The complete foreclosure of all possibilities is at the same time free movement. Absolute necessity includes everything, but the consequence of this is free contingency. To understand this consequence, we must reconceive of what totality means. Okay, so really this is the main point I'm trying to make in the paper. If totality means to uncover every positive category of thought, to expose every moment of history, in short, to exhaust every facet of determinate being, then we might conclude from this that Hegel stands on one side of a dialectic and apophasis appears as the limit of Hegel's thought. But what I have attempted to expose by threading together these three arguments is that totality for Hegel cannot be separated from negativity and contradiction. Just as there are two kinds of truth in the preface to the Phenomenology, there are likewise two kinds of totality. There is the kind of totality that contains everything by excluding that which cannot be said, the fragment, the ineffable, the absolute other of the system. But then there is the kind of totality, which I think is the more Hegelian kind, that contains everything because it contains its opposite. This second kind of totality incorporates within it that which it cannot include. Hegel does not talk about the bad finite explicitly in the finitude chapter of the Logic, but I think that this is an appropriate name for the kind of totality, which, for the first kind of totality, which stands against the apophatic as the articulation of everything that can be said, because it is the exhaustion of the finite. Yet the second kind of totality, that which totalizes by way of the negative and the contradictory, leaves us in a paradox. To articulate the whole means to incorporate even that which cannot be said as part of the fabric of totality. This paradox is the real limit of Hegel's thought. Negation and contradiction exhaust every formulation of everything, not only by bringing all finite determinate being into actuality, but more importantly, by including pure alterity as a genuine moment of totality and as the essential condition for completion. This total exhaustion by way of the negative and the contradictory can be seen as the real limit of Hegel's thought. If the apophatic approaches even that which is beyond the limit of Hegel, it traces the negation of a paradox, so the negation of this paradox, that already contains this negation as well. Since the limit of Hegel to think the undialectical fragment that cannot coincide with its opposite is already included in Hegel's system of absolute possibility and absolute possibility and absolute alterity, what the apophatic approaches is the exclusion of what cannot be excluded in Hegel.
but to give at least a few minutes for every speaker, do we have a couple of questions for Nahum? Please try to keep it short if possible.
Well, if no one else, I'm happy to jump in. Thank you very much for that, and I think the 3 points that you isolate here could easily be expanded into all sorts of other pairings, as others have shown. Temporal pairings of past, present, and future. Catherine Malibu does a huge job in her first book on doing precisely what you're attempting here in showing that the one is already included in the other. It works in the syllogisms that he works out in the encyclopedia proper. Infinite and finite. These pairings, I think, you've isolated 3, but I think they're throughout all of his work. And the contradiction there, the quote that you gave, the key for me is the question of the movement as vitality. And one term that I didn't raise, but I think is important in all of these pairings, is the question of an organicism. That the reason, and this is where I'm not fully convinced about your exclusion, that cannot be excluded. The reason these are constantly, these opposites and paradoxes are constantly operating or vital is precisely because of a certain organicism that Hegel is always appealing to. That opposites themselves are living, are engaging. And let's go back to the question of the environment again. In fact, it would undermine his anthropomorphic, or certainly Koyev's anthropomorphic reading of the human being. That always is in an organic relationship. And so that even exclusion and inclusion are organically related to
Right. Yeah, no, and that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, I see in hearing your paper this idea of a generative, the negative as generating and as sort of organic kind of life coming from the negation. And yeah, and I didn't emphasize that, but I don't think that they're out of touch with each other. The reading I'm giving of how the totality would have to, is really about negation, and not sort of a totality that would then be against something outside of it. Yeah, okay, no, thank you.
Okay, the final question, Stephen Palmquist, please.
Thank you very much. I was interested in your quotes and comments on Hegel, talking about the relevant significance of identity and contradiction. I'm just wondering if he says anything that you're aware of about the law of excluded middle.
Yeah, he does. Yeah, go on, sorry.
And if so, what? And in relation to that contrast between identity and contradiction.
Yeah, and maybe Andrew can help with this, but as far as I remember, I have to look at the logic again, but there's, I believe there is a remark on the law of the excluded middle in the section of the logic on identity, difference, and contradiction. So the quote I read about contradiction comes out of a remark on contradiction, but just before that, I believe, is the law of the excluded middle. Am I right about this?
Yeah, there is, and also in the middle book, I think, Philosophy of Mind in the encyclopedia, where he works out really Aristotle's syllogism. And he works out that he treats the issue there as well.
And then also in the final doctrine of the logic, on the concept of the Begriff, there's a section about syllogisms and judgments, and I believe there's stuff about the law of the excluded middle. He does an analysis there also. Yeah.
So would it be correct to say that he attempts to overcome it? That he's doing something like what I've called the law of the included middle, or does he not go in that direction?
I think it's really a live debate in Hegel scholarship, and it's a difficult point to work out. My sense from the reading I'm giving now is that contradiction is productive in presenting us with a kind of totality which is including alterity in a genuine way.
You used that word included a lot.
Yeah,
so
I did,
That's what made me ask your question.
Okay, right. So it may be somewhat close because I know you mentioned Hegel in your talk, and it's. I think we're in similar territory here. But I guess the point I want to try to block, and it's a point similar to what Andrew is also blocking, is this idea of a synthesis that brings us back to an identity which is somehow more important than the negation itself. And so I see that in the totality isn't exactly an identity again, is the idea. The totality is genuinely about the apophatic and is holding identity together with oppositions.
Well, excellent. We are out of time. So, our final speaker, at least of this part of the program before the coffee break, which maybe we might have to shrink a little, is David Chai. So unfortunately there's no coffee, but there's more Coke. So if anyone would like to replace caffeine with Coke, then there's a possibility here. So David Chai, who joins us from the Chinese University of Hong Kong, will speak about apophaticism and Taoist meontology, two sides of the same coin? Question mark.
Yes. More of a rhetorical question than anything. First of all, I just a short preface. My being here is because of happy coincidence. Professor Frank came to our department at Chinese U and gave a talk, and I had the opportunity to express some of the Chinese side of the unsayability debate going on, and so I was very graciously invited at the last minute to participate here. So I thank him for that, and my thanks to yes, there you are, for being also very welcoming in your emails and so on. So thank you both. A little bit on the word meontology. Some of you may not be familiar with that. That's become a bit of a catchphrase of mine. A way to avoid using the term negative theology, via negativa, creatio ex nihilo, that are typically used in Western discourse. Meontology, of course, was used by Levinas. It also appears in certain Jewish philosophical writings. But I went back to the ancient Greek. From the very beginning, the first time the word meon, to meon was used. So discussion of what is not non-being as a way to present my particular vision of Taoist nothingness or non-being in a positive light. So when I speak of the meontological, what I am referring to is nothingness as a creative source, not as a opposition or as a barrier or as something that results in the annihilation of something else. And in that regard, I view it in very metaphysical terms. And a lot of the discussion, especially the first two talks today, we've seen negative theology or apophatism as a kind of question of language or of otherness, right, as an encounter. And for me, nothingness actually is the starting point from which we can then further think and discuss pertinent questions about being and so on. So that's what I mean by meontology. So I will just read my very short script here. I imagine we'll speed things up a little bit. In 2007, William Frank published his 2-volume source book, which is a very wonderful resource, and I think we're all very much in debt to the years he spent writing that. On what cannot be said, apophatic discourses in philosophy, religion, literature, and the arts. The first work of its kind, it has become the go-to source for those interested in the arts of negative discourse and their impact on the human condition. a bond, so between negative discourse and discussion of the human condition, made clear on page 2 of the first volume, where he says, and I quote, "The irrepressible impulse to speak, essential silence, is a constant, or a close constant in brackets, of human experience confronted ever anew with what surpasses anything." End quote. For me, this is surely a moment of the sublime. Right? The failure of language to touch upon the core of the ineffable is the guiding thread that links all the figures discussed in On What Cannot Be Said. Frank's task is thus to show that, quote, "open dialogue on what cannot be said lurks as an ineluctable provocation, perhaps in all discourses." And that's from page 7 of volume 1. Now, given that it's a source book and not a philosophical discussion, On What Cannot Be Said was itself unable to plumb the depths of the unsayable. There remained thus a need for a more philosophical line of inquiry, and indeed, that is precisely what a philosophy of the unsayable endeavors to achieve. Covering the same group of thinkers as before, a philosophy of the unsayable philosophizes what, by definition, is more commonly thought of as mysticism, especially if we're talking middle period thinkers like Avicenna, Maimonides, Ibn Arabi, and so on. Then traditional philosophy, much like Chinese philosophy, is not traditional or real philosophy. It's used in terms of mystical language or experience. Indeed, Frank hints as much when he says, and I quote from page 316, right at the end, "What then is negative theology?" A very good question, which unfortunately he saves for the very end of his work. "It seems to be practically nothing, and potentially everything." A very good answer. "It is desire reaching beyond the conceivable. Is there not necessarily a metaphysical residue in this form, or rather formlessness of faith? It is a believing in what we cannot conceive, by nevertheless desiring it with a desire directed beyond all that can be presently ascertained as either real or possible." End quote. This is an interesting definition, for me at least, for two reasons. First, the weight given to the practically nothing, and the potentially everything, is not evenly distributed, in my mind. It would appear to favor the creatio ex nihilo of the latter over the nihilism of the former. Second, in favoring the negative's potential to be actualized everywhere and in everything, it becomes more than a transcendental encounter, insofar as the negative itself assumes a transcendent status equal to that of being, capital B. This elevation of negativity to the realm of being is commonplace in the Eastern philosophical traditions of Buddhism and Taoism. I don't feel the research. But in the West, only a handful of figures come close to seeing nothingness in this way. One such figure that Frank discusses early on in his book, specifically chapter 2, is Hegel. And I will admit, here and now, I am not a Hegel specialist. However, I have used the science of logic in my own work, and it's a good place to serve as a platform for our discussion. So I quote from page 51. Frank says, "Hegel is crucial to contemporary apathetics, for he opens being and thought up in total exposure to, quote-unquote, the negative. Thus, his thinking realizes itself only by passage through a radically negative theology." End quote. Indeed, we can see how so-called negativity serves as the medium through which a more profound act takes place in Hegel's Science of Logic. And I quote here, as a rather long quote, this is from the Miller translation of 1969, page 166. Hegel says this: "That the void is the source of movement has not the trivial meaning that something can only move into an empty space and not into an already occupied space. For, in such a space, it would not find any more open room. Understood in this sense, the void would be only the presupposition or condition of movement, not its ground. just as the movement itself, too, would be presupposed as already existing. The essential point, its ground, being forgotten. The view that the void constitutes the ground of movement contains the profounder thought that in the negative, as such, there lies the ground of becoming. Now, for me, as a Taoist scholar, this is very interesting. Right? The negative as the ground of becoming. Hence, my preference for the use of meontology and defining it as that. Right? Of the unrest of self-movement, Hegel also says. In which sense, however, the negative is to be taken as the veritable negativity of the infinite. End quote. Okay? The veritable negativity of the infinite. Now, some Western scholars have defined Tao, which Professor Wang has talked about earlier, in such terms, okay? as an infinitely negative source of creation. Although Frank's examination of Hegel is largely limited to the latter's discussion on truth in thinking, Hegel's analysis of negativity in the logic gives us much more to consider as a philosophical framework in its own right, especially when it comes to knowing the unknowable mystery of ultimate reality. If we're talking about God in the West, or Tao in the East, or Buddha in India. Our inability to speak of the ultimate, no matter how we designate it, is testament not only to the limitations of language, but human thinking. If we are to appreciate the value of negativity, we must refrain from portraying it as a destructive force, an evil of creation, as the symbolic and literal end to all that is sayable. Rather, nothingness is what makes thinking possible from the Chinese standpoint. And as such, is the authentic becoming from which all beginnings and endings arise. To quote from Hegel, once again, he says, this is page 105 of the translation, becoming is the unseparatedness of being and nothing, not the unity which abstracts from being and nothing. But as the unity of being and nothing, it is this unity, but it is this determinate unity in which there is both being and nothing. So this sounds very familiar to what Taoism is trying to do. Bring together in harmonious coexistence. Not necessarily polar opposites, but mutual pairings, being, non-being, right, wrong, life, death, and so on and so on. And he goes on, he says, but insofar as being and nothing, each unseparated from its other, is, each is not. They are therefore in this unity, but only as a vanishing, sublated moment. End quote. So Frank is very correct in saying that, and I quote from page 54 of the text, Hegel is important for correcting the total mystification of the wholly other, and the concomitant erecting of an altar to the idol of the unknowable. This is poetry. It's beautiful. What is unknowable is concretely experienced right within knowing, even absolute knowing, in scare quotes, as its inadequacy in its a priori. End quote. What is more, Frank writes, and I quote again, because it's such a rich text that I cannot contain myself. He says, quote, the unsayable must be expressed in contradictory forms because it can have no proper identity of its own, but exerts absolute decisive influence in all directions on everything else. If it had any kind of identity, then what cannot be said would be, to that extent, sayable. And that's on page 57. Okay, so now I turn to the Chinese side. This idea, what cannot be said would be sayable, mirrors what we see in ancient China, specifically in Taoism. And an example from the Tao Te Ching, which Qingjie quoted earlier, we have this sentence here. Quote, those who understand Tao do not speak of it. Those who speak of Tao do not truly understand it. End quote. In the second great Taoist classic of China, that of Zhuangzi, chapter 2, we have the following. Quote, the great Tao is not named, great discriminations are not spoken, great benevolence is not benevolent, great modesty is not humble, great daring does not attack. Tao, and this is the crux, Tao made clear is not the true Tao. Discriminations put into words will prove insufficient. So saying the unsayable is insufficient. This idea stands in contrast to the thought of perhaps the most famous early Chinese philosopher, Confucius, and his theory of names. It's chapter 13.3 of the Analects. Confucius writes, quote, "If names are not rectified, speech will not accord with reality. When speech does not accord with reality, things will not be successfully accomplished. This is why the gentleman," the erudite, right, the educated person, "this is why the gentleman only applies names that can be properly spoken and assures that what he says can be properly put into action." End quote. Thus, when Frank notes, quote, "What cannot be said enables us to unite as if under one cover a vast range of texts tethered to vastly different experiences embedded in a widely disparate sphere of culture and history," end quote, that's from page 58, "we can very legitimately and justifiably so include the works of early China amongst them." So what is critical to the apophatic argument, however, is not simply giving voice to that which is inherently voiceless. Rather, it is about exposing the nothingness that grounds the unsayable, what I call the meontological. If we return to the Zhuangzi, we will find the following quotation from chapter 13. Zhuangzi says, "The men of the world who value Tao turn to books." And this is very similar to what Qingjie gave the quote of wheelwright pianism. Right? Those who value Tao turn to books. But books are nothing more than words. Words have value, but what is of value in words is meaning. Meaning has something it is pursuing, but the thing it is pursuing cannot be put into words or transmitted. The world values words and hands down books, and although it values them as such, I, Zhuangzi, do not think them worth valuing. Why? What the world takes to be of value is not real value. What is truly valuable, in other words, for Zhuangzi, is the unsayable, right? Is the invisible. Frank, interestingly, puts it this way, and this is from page 59. He says, "We must let go of all these concepts," and here he's referring to experience, consciousness, and revelation, "in order to let what they cannot express disclose itself. It does so in this very relinquishing of concepts in discourse, in the unsaying that lets what cannot be said show up, and to this extent be nothing that can be said, even to be." End quote. Letting the unspeakable speak for itself via the language of negativity hence renders users of apophatic discourse, in Frank's terms, witnesses to their encounters with nothingness, whereby, and I quote from page 58, he says, "Truth, essence, or totality vanish under the temporality of all that can be said and represented, leaving only traces that are not themselves," end quote. And trace, of course, I immediately think of Derrida, but we can go back to the commentator Qingjie mentioned of Zhuangzi, who is Guo Xia, who used the concept of trace as a philosophical concept. Right? Turned that into something very unique to himself. And Hans George, I'm sure, would have something to add to that, yes, as a fellow Taoist scholar. Derridean trace is a key to language's deconstruction, but rather than seeing it as a means to an end in the West, we can employ the Taoist perspective to argue that the trace-like nature of language is itself quantifiable, and so cannot be taken as symbolizing the traceless reality of the Creator, be it God or God. The difference between the Western and Eastern conceptualization of the trace thus lies in their particular application of what each takes to be apophatic. Thus, while Frank brilliantly outlines the many nuances of the West's love-hate relationship with nothingness, and we've had discussion of that with Hegel, the more one reads his book, the more one realizes that the Western discourse is limited to explicating human finitude in light of